All right, I still see people climbing in, but it looks like we've kind of reached critical mass. So I'm going to go ahead. Helena Bottemiller Evich, longtime reporter, founder of Food Fix, a newsletter about food policy. We have a really great panel today to talk about food safety, FDA, and the new Congress. This was hosted and convened by Invariant, which is a government affairs and strategic communications firm here in Washington that does a lot of work on food and agriculture. We are going to take questions from the audience. So if you want to enter those in the chat, you can also raise your hand, I believe, and I will call on you at the end. But I think the best way is probably enter any questions you have into the chat. We also have some questions that folks have already submitted, which were great. So we will weave some of those into the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists who are all go-to experts in this space. All three of them are people I call to get the scoop on what's going on and to get their perspective on these issues. So really great lineup. I'm not going to read their whole bios, but you can go follow them and look them up. They're very impressive. We have Jennifer McIntyre, who is the Chief Food Safety and Regulatory Officer for the International Fresh Produce Association, formerly known to many as United Fresh. She is a go-to expert on food safety here in Washington and also clearly has a lot of expertise on produce issues. Then we have Brian Ronholm, Director of Food Policy at Consumer Reports. Brian is a go-to source on, really anything regarding consumers and food, not just pure food safety issues, but also things like, infant formula and heavy metals in baby food and all sorts of other issues. And then we have Steve Mondernock, who is the executive director of the Association of Food and Drug Officials, who's really a go-to expert on the nexus between federal and state food policy and food safety and how we manage all of that. Because as many of you may know, a lot of our food safety inspections are done through the states. So it's a very important nexus to understand. So today we're going to talk about, what to expect on the FDA food safety front in the new Congress. I think, there's a lot of big questions about what divided government is going to mean for this space. Clearly, we're going to have Republicans taking control of the House. We're not exactly sure about the margin in the Senate, but we're going to keep Democratic control. So we're definitely going to be in a divided government situation. And it'll be, I think, very interesting to see what issues in this, realm can be bipartisan and which issues maybe we won't hear as much about going forward. So I want to first start out with kind of a lay of the land, and I'm going to kick it to you, Brian, first to just find out, what are you watching for in the new Congress? What are who are the players that you're most tracking when we get things started in January? What is on your radar right now as we go into the new Congress when you're thinking about all that's going on the FDA and food safety landscape?
Yeah, thanks, Helena. So I think what a lot of us will be looking at is, how are the new dynamics are going to play in the new Congress? Who are going to be the new go-to leaders, on the committees, particularly the main committees dealing with FDA food issues, the Senate Health, House Energy Commerce, the appropriations. How is the divided government going to play out? And quite honestly, I think we've long been in a situation where even if Democrats had control, there was still a lot of kind of slow moving parts just because the margins were so small, especially in the Senate. And so, I think that limited a lot of ability to do much in this space. But I think, one particular issue, several particular issues that are going to, I think, receive a lot of bipartisan attention is associated with how the FDA foods program is functioning, how it's governed, how the performance is going. Certainly, there's been a lot of bipartisan concern over the last couple of years as it relates to the infant formula mess. So some of these several outbreaks that may be linked to kind of the delay in these FSMA rules being pushed through. So I think there's going to be a lot of bipartisan scrutiny into how FDA foods program is performing, how is fragmented structure impacting the way it governs and operates? And can there be fixes that can kind of smoothen things out and get FDA back on track of the foods program? So I think that's one issue in particular that I think we're all following, that we all think will receive bipartisan attention for sure.
Yeah, and we'll definitely come back to the FDA review issue. As some of the audience may or may not know, there is a review happening with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, an outside review on FDA's foods program, and we're expecting to have the results of that review next week. So we'll come back to that. But Jennifer, I want to kick it to you. What are you looking for in the new Congress in terms of just like the macro dynamics and how that will play out in the issues that you're following?
Yeah, I think fortunately, as Brian kind of suggested, food safety, nutrition tends to be a more bipartisan issue. It's kind of hard to argue against safe food for people. The talking points may differ, the details, may differ, and we're pretty used to some churn, changes in people, changes in role, telling our story as a food system to people in Congress who are either new or sometimes tenured. So I think the conversation is something that all of us probably feel pretty comfortable engaging in. Food safety better not be a divisive issue, and so I'm pretty optimistic that moving forward, regardless of who's in charge of what particular roles are, that everyone will care enough about food safety to at least listen to what we have to say. And we have been the broad food system, industry groups, consumer groups, regulatory groups like AFTA. We've been quite aligned for quite some time in terms of what we're looking for. So I think that that's pretty advantageous also when we're talking to a new Congress.
All right, Steve, what about you? What are you looking for in the new Congress as we do a changeover in power here?
Well, I think one thing that we're hearing from the other Republicans on the House side is I think we're going to see more oversight. And FDA is one of those areas where they're definitely interested in doing some additional oversight work, perhaps more than what's happened recently, and perhaps into a greater detail. So I think that's one area we might see more work in. The other side of this is I think we're going to have to see I'm just going to say, I hope the agency develops a better message, because that is the one thing that is shocking to me when I talk to members and their staffs, is the agency has not done a good job of communicating with appropriators or the policymakers what they need and why. That is just message is just not getting through. So I think better messaging would be one of the things I would hope for them, because naturally I want a better system, and currently it's not working. And I think that's one of the things that I would hope for. I do anticipate that there's going to be an all-out push from the administration for more funding. I don't know what that's going to look like. Clearly, I think they're beginning to put their hand out there. User fees keep getting talked about. I think that's one of the areas they're going to go to, which I would argue does not make sense in the food space. But that's a whole nother issue. But I do think that that's one of the things they're thinking, and perhaps maybe not broad-based user fees, but user fees in certain niche areas, such as, you can think of them, maybe it's dietary supplements, maybe it's additives and colors in some of those niche areas, and a more robust program there. So those are some things that I'm kind of watching for and expecting going forward.
Yeah, I think oversight is a big one, right? And the question of whether or not House Republicans pick up some of these threads. We saw hearings in May about the infant formula shortage, and I think there were 3 or 4 hearings in a short amount of time, but we haven't really heard as much lately. I'm curious, maybe Brian, I'll kick it to you. Like, do you see infant formula driving some of the oversight, like that issue? Because we're still seeing disruptions at retail. Or do you think that maybe House Republicans will take more of a holistic approach, like what is going on at FDA's foods program?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely will look at this infant formula, to your point, this ongoing infant formula crisis as kind of a symptom of kind of a greater problem, and kind of use that as leverage to scrutinize the agency a little more. do a little more oversight, take a closer look at how they're funded and where the funding is going. I think that that's a big piece of this that will get scrutiny as well, is that, when FSMA passed, you kind of saw this period where FDA was receiving increased funding, but yet you saw the rate of food inspections decline over time. So, how does that happen when they get more funding? And, where does that money go? And certainly, ORA resource management is a big piece of that. So I can certainly see House Republicans take a close look at that more and see if that's kind of emblematic of a greater problem that the foods program is facing. And the messaging, to Steve's point too, it's so crucial to this, because anytime that they've come out with statement on infant formula, they seem to indicate that everything is okay out there, and when they look at the numbers. But yet, as soon as we hear those reports, we immediately get on the horn with folks that we know that rely on infant formula, and they tell us the same thing. It's like, no, we still have a problem finding product on the shelves. So where is that disconnect between the numbers that they get and what's happening to consumers out in the marketplace? So certainly that'll get a lot more attention.
Yeah, I still have that question, because the retail data is so far from the experience that a lot of consumers are actually having in store. Just following up on that inspection issue you mentioned, I think a lot of people don't realize that FDA got, a lot more resources, not fully what Congress said they would need to implement FSMA, the big food safety update from more than a decade ago, but they did get a substantial increase in resources, and yet food safety inspections have gone down, which I think it's fair to say was not Congress's intent. With that, they had an inspection frequency mandate, and then also obviously the more resources. Steve, I was hoping you could jump in and talk a little bit about what the conversation is right now about food safety inspections. The other big question I have is, we had this big infant formula situation, and FDA had done a routine inspection right before this massive recall. And, they went back in that plant and found really egregious conditions that weren't found, just a few months earlier. So I do wonder if there isn't going to be a little bit more scrutiny on just the caliber of inspections and also how many of them there are. So I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
Sure. Well, let me start a little bit over the inspection mandate that was in FSMA. So FSMA included a what should have been a minimum number of inspections. Regretfully, that's been interpreted more as the maximum number of inspections we can accomplish. Even if there are additional resources, it seems there's not a willingness of the agency to continue doing more work in the current format. I will say there was one precipitating factor to the reduction in inspection numbers, and that was really moving to PC inspections. PC inspections do take substantially more time. And, when I say substantially, I'm talking, 3 to 4 times more time oftentimes than what a traditional GMP inspection or good manufacturing
You should stop and explain what a PC inspection is, because not everyone knows.
Sure. Full inspection would be happening in those facilities that are probably doing true manufacturing work, not necessarily in warehouses and other facilities covered under FSMA. But in those manufacturing facilities, you're examining the whole system to make sure the system is indeed appropriate and identifying the risks within that could contribute to illness or other harm throughout your factory and inputs into your factory, essentially. And I'm sure, Jennifer, would you have a more articulate way of saying that? But those would be the basic way I'd put it, versus the traditional GMP inspection is much more of a floors, walls, and ceilings approach. Is it clean? Are they doing it? Is it basically what we would expect? Those sorts of things, and a much faster inspection. So that really did have a precipitating factor on the numbers. So I'm going to be sympathetic there. The other challenge that I think all of government is facing, and it doesn't matter if it's FDA, states, locals, anyone, we're all facing a hiring challenge and a change in the workforce. We were all pretty used to the fact once we hired you, you were going to be with us probably until you retired. So you would be there 20, 30, 40 years in your working for your state, local, or federal agency. That is no longer the case. And our systems really weren't built for that relatively dramatic change and this is a fair criticism for all of us, we're having to retool and rethink about how we train people. How do we get them up to speed faster, get them competent and up to speed faster? We may have to rethink things. Let me give you one example. For those of you that are, but most of you have probably never actually seen an FDA inspection report. An FDA inspection report is a narrative report that goes on often for many pages, even if there are no violations found. Sometimes hundreds of pages if there are violations found. But that is not very useful data in so many ways, because to actually understand what happens, you're having to go take it back out, categorize it, figure out where it's at, and all of that sort of work. Not to mention, it's not particularly easy for the investigator or inspector to write that report. It takes a whole lot more time. We may have to think about structured data in the future. That is one way we can move things faster and get reports done quicker and still maintain the quality and ensure everything's been examined. So that's something that's done in a lot of other areas, but has never been adopted in the food program in general, outside of produce. Produce is somewhat structured data set. Everything else is not. So that's another, I'll stop there though.
Great. Okay. Well, we also have Adam Tarr on our panel here, which I did not even realize. Sorry, guys. Whatever list I have, Adam, VIP, former Senate Agriculture staff, also an expert on these issues. I want you to hop in here. We are about to have a divided Congress. What are you telling your clients, your, favorite food and Aggies on the Hill about what's going to change regarding this space? And do you see Congress getting into the weeds on these questions? Like we're just talking about food safety inspections. It might not be something that is super sexy or like an everyday topic, but really is important. And I think everyone on this panel gets that the number of food safety inspections, the quality of them, really does play an important role in the food safety system. It's not like this thing that we just do for fun. So how detailed do you think Congress is going to get on all of this?
No, it's a good question, Helena. Thanks for letting me crash.
Hop in, yeah.
Thanks for doing this. We really appreciate it. No, I think, and you probably know this just as well as anyone else, given how long you've covered this issue. Congress tends to be motivated to look at food safety when there's a crisis, and then the next crisis comes up that's not food safety, and then they sort of move on to the next thing. I do think, though, to Steve's point, you have a Republican House coming into power that has said that oversight is going to be a priority. If you look at Republican leadership on the Energy and Commerce Committee, talking about McMorris Rogers, Representatives Guthrie and Griffith, they have weighed in with FDA with some very detailed questions, and I would sort of expect that to continue. Obviously, looking to see who chairs House Agapropes. This is someone who's going to have an audience, a public audience with FDA, and an opportunity to push them. We don't think that divided government is necessarily bad. It doesn't have to result in a standstill. I think, progress can be made. I think a lot of what we're talking about today is, I think, potentially inbounds, because so much of the issues that USDA or at FDA rather are structural, right? I mean, I'm sure you'll find folks who say we need to give FDA more money. Obviously, that might not fly with the Republican House, but when you talk about sort of making common sense improvements to government that don't cost money, I mean, I think those are things that we might find interest in a Republican House. It'll just be interesting to see, do we go beyond beating up on FDA to actually moving the needle on fixes? And I think, we'll just have to sort of see how that plays out. I think it'll also take quickly a sustained commitment from the great folks on this call, but also other folks in the community. Consumer Brands has obviously launched a push. I mean, I think we just need to keep putting these issues in front of Congress in between the inevitable crises that come up.
Yeah, that's one of the things that has really struck me about what's different about this moment we're in is, well, there's a lot of alignment between consumer groups, industry groups, state groups, basically every stakeholder, outside stakeholder is aligned in wanting to see serious reforms at FDA, and not just aligned, which I think that's maybe been there for a while, but very organized and fired up. I'm I've been surprised, right? I did a big story back, in April about all this dysfunction, and I've been really, really, truly shocked by how much of that conversation has like grown a life of its own by all these groups still talking about it, right? They're meeting regularly, and you mentioned the Consumer Brands Association launching their campaign to like put this on folks' radar. I'm curious, I don't know if Jennifer, you want to weigh in, you've been in this space for a long time. Like, what do you see about what's different now? Like, is it that industry and consumer groups see a real opportunity to kind of get changes to happen? Or like, what is different about this year and what we're seeing now? Because the conversation has, I think, kept up in a way that just is sort of unexpected.
Yeah, I think the last time I saw something like this with groups coming together was in that critical period right before FSMA passed and then right after FSMA passed. So we're talking, 10, 12 years ago now, where everyone was aligned that we needed food safety regulation, that congressional intervention was warranted, that we supported a strong and effective FDA. And I think that we were met with some success. Things seemed to go well for a few years. Did people have particular issues? Of course. Were there still outbreaks and other crises? Yeah. But the working relationship, I think, between FDA and all of our stakeholder groups was decent, good enough, can't complain. It's really within the past couple of years that there's been a bit of a shift in that relationship, in that engagement. Having the high hopes and the aspirations for what we would collectively achieve by FSMA, have not been fully realized. We're still waiting on a number of documents, and there are delays and things get bumped around. And so I think that the time came and we continued to see outbreaks, crises, where you start to scratch your head and say, is this really where we need to be? Is this how we should be operating as a food and food safety community? And your article back in, I think it was April, Helena, was influential. It got several of us talking who had been talking in one-off conversations before, but to realize that we have an awful lot in common. We have a lot of concerns in common, and that perhaps we had reached that point in time where we needed to come back together and share a bit more about what we were doing, what we were thinking, what we were seeing, what we wanted the future to look like when it came to food safety, to our multiple relationships with FDA. And I think that the reason that we have continued to meet on a very regular basis and work together is because we see not only an opportunity for change, maybe it's better put, I think we're kind of forcing that opportunity, because change wouldn't happen if it wasn't for us working together. I don't know that, but why change if you don't have to, right? It's easier to maintain the status quo, but the status quo is not working. And so us coming together and continuing to talk about these issues and keep them at that elevated level. Adam mentioned other issues come up. We know that Congress and the public are going to be, I don't want to say distracted by other issues, but people eat many times a day. So we want to make sure that food safety continues to be top of mind, and that we're not gonna let it go, that we're not going to play second fiddle or third fiddle to other issues within FDA, other issues within society at large, that we want to make sure that we set things up for the next 10 years or beyond in terms of structure, in terms of the relationships with FDA, the collaboration, the efficiency, the opportunities to leverage new ways of doing things. I think Steve raised a lot of excellent points about things that worked in the past, maybe aren't going to work for the future. So it feels like now is the right time to make some bold recommendations and hope for some impactful change.
Yeah, Brian, I want you to weigh in on this too, because I know from talking to you over the years that you've certainly long had frustrations about how long certain things, particularly consumer protection things, take at FDA. Deadlines are often missed. FSMA took a long time. You've been frustrated for a while. I think that's fair to say. But what do you see about what's different about the moment we're in? I mean, the organization, the conversation definitely seems to be sustained, and I assume it will be sustained in the new year. But what is different, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just building on Jen's point, I mean, I think this type of alignment that exists now with consumer groups, with industry groups, with state, local regulators, it's unprecedented. And I think it's a reflection of just a high level of frustration that we all feel about what's going on with FDA and the foods program. The way things are transpiring now, especially post FSMA, is they aren't serving anyone well. You know, they aren't protecting consumers, they aren't protecting public health. They're certainly not, you know, allowing industry to operate effectively. They're, you know, undercutting state and local regulation partners. So you know, all of that builds into this level of frustration. Your piece did an excellent job of just encapsulating everything that we've all talked about over the years, and sort of reflected in that frustration buildup. And that's what brought us all together. And you know, all of these kind of one-on-one conversations turned into kind of a group conversation organically, and allowed us to meet on a regular basis and come up with ideas of collaborating, not only with these bold ideas and how to reform the FDA, but also just working together on other projects. So, you know, it has this ability to sustain over time, to Jen's point. And I think that's really going to be critical in carrying a lot of these groups forward, a lot of this work forward, and hoping we get to that point where we can have, you know, an effective functioning FDA foods program.
Yeah. And I encourage everyone to go read up, you know, read the Politico story, read the reporting that's been done on on these frustrations, because I think sometimes you know, it sounds like a real, you know, wonky, like bureaucratic thing, like, oh, FDA is slow, lots of government agencies are slow. But I think to both of your points, like these frustrations about like really serious dysfunction have been brewing for a long time. And what's been so interesting to me as a reporter covering this is the unbelievable level of consensus about the problems and sort of what's not working. That's kind of unusual. Like people usually are more, you know, disagreeing about things. So, I mean, on that, I want to sort of pivot to, I want to make sure we have time to talk about this review that's going to be happening, or is happening right now, underway with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is an outside but closely linked, you know, nonprofit that sort of supports FDA. They are, you know, over the summer, Commissioner Califf essentially said, you know, we're asking this outside group to review the foods program and make some recommendations, although it's not all of the foods program, which we can get into. But Steve, I was hoping maybe you could kick us off by like, what are you expecting from this review? What did you think about the process? I don't want to get too in the weeds of like how it all worked, but you know, just to give the audience a sense of like what this review might mean or might not, and what you're expecting. Do we still have?
I guess.
Good. I'm glad your hotel Wi-Fi has kept you going.
Oh, well, I think the first thing I might suggest is I think we're prepared. We're not expecting a lot, given 60 days and a relatively limited amount of time to do a review. And frankly, many of the experts that were chosen for the panel had been far removed from the food program for a pretty extended period of time. So even just getting them up to speed on the basics of FSMA and where we're at today was a pretty huge lift. While I'm cautiously, I'm hoping it's better than I expect. My expectation is going to be a little bit more like a trading spaces. We might paint a few rooms, move some furniture around from another room, but we're probably not going to make move any walls or do the substantive changes we probably need in the organization. Now, that being said, I would argue that some of that, their hands were tied. 60 days wasn't an adequate amount of time if you really wanted to look at the problem. Secondly, you know, I would argue perhaps the expert panel could have had been a little bit more robust and representative of the community today. And I think those are two challenges they had. And, I'm hoping I'll come back on next week and say, oh my God, this is amazing. They took everything into account and we're extremely perceptive, but I don't think that's probably where we're at. We're probably going to see a few tweaks. We're probably going to see some of the things the commissioner really wants, which is more money, better IT. I expect those to be the themes of the report, and perhaps a little twist on nutrition, given that they put two people that were primarily interested out of the 6 in nutrition issues. So those would be my expectations for the report, and I hope I'm wrong.
That's a very interesting analysis and prediction. I don't know what they're going to do, but Adam, do you want to weigh in? I don't know. What's your crystal ball telling you about what this review is going to?
Well, Steve and Jennifer are really my crystal ball on what the report is telling us. So
not I don't reading know that the tea leaves on the comments and the document.
No, I mean, I think Steve is obviously very close to this and has been working on this space for a long time. So I would certainly defer to him on where things are going. And then I think we and others in the community can plan appropriately as it relates to, sort of advocacy for the Hill shortly after the first of the year.
Jennifer, what are you expecting? Oh, go ahead. Jump in.
So there's one other thing to note. There's another review going on that's being led by the Principal Deputy Commissioner Janet Woodcock at FDA on the foods program. And what I've been shocked at is people relatively in the know that have been interviewed for one or the other don't understand which one they're interviewed for, don't really understand the process. So we have 2 simultaneous reviews going on, unclear how they feed into each other, and frankly, not particularly transparent or public, which is challenging, I think, overall in such a public program.
Helena, I am anxious to see what comes out of this review. Clearly it took way more than 60 days to develop the problems that that resulted in this review. I don't think we're going to see solutions in 60 days. I view it as a critical first step, but we would be naive to think that this is the be all end all, the only step. One thing that really stood out to me, I will say, is that when Steve, Brian, a number of others were fortunate enough to be invited by the panel to kind of share our experiences, answer some questions of the expert panel. I think there were 6 different sessions. There were maybe 5 or 6 people of us per session. We were asked fairly similar questions, diverse group, when you consider it was whatever, 30, 40 of us, remarkable consensus, to hear what we as a collective group said, independent of each other. You would have thought that we had scripted together or something. There was just the themes that emerged around how FDA was working today, where we saw opportunities for improvement, like the appointment of an empowered deputy commissioner for foods that had real authority over the foods program. Almost every single panelist that was invited referenced this. So we'll see if it winds up in the final report. We've been forewarned that was not the only source of input by this expert panel. But when you looked at the public portal and you looked at the comments, anybody could offer comments. They were fairly anonymous, but still categorized by, sector, like FDA employees. There were some scathing comments in there. Some comments that really concerned me, if this is the culture internal within the agency, that maybe things were even worse than we feared. So there's a lot of work I think that that's going to take a sustained effort. And I think that it's going to take much more than just money. It's going to take people and a willingness to change and a willingness to embrace new ways of doing things. How can a report make concrete recommendations that get us to that end? I'm not sure, but hopefully this is a useful first step. But I think we're all anticipating that we're going to have to put more work into this process in order to help the agency help us and help consumers.
Yeah, you mentioned the deputy commissioner role. So essentially, for maybe those in the audience who don't fully understand that ask, it's essentially the ask is to create a role that oversees all of the foods programs, so CIFSAN, CVM, and also the food inspection parts of ORA. So think about it, the food inspectors, all that under one, and have a one person in charge, because as I've reported, and I think others are aware, there's been a lot of leadership sort of turf battle, power struggle.
Everything Helena said.
Did we lose Helena?
I think Helena's frozen. Yeah.
The decision-making structure is clear. Just in case people don't know.
You froze momentarily, Helena. We were all worried about Steve's connectivity, but
Am I back? I'm going to switch Wi-Fi. I switched
you're back.
Wi-Fi.
You're back.
Okay, good. It's always something. So, I just want to fill that in case, anyone in the audience sort of doesn't know that the kind of organizational structure question, or the situation there, why the deputy commissioner asked, what the context of that is. So I'm curious, Brian, do you see the inclusion or exclusion of that recommendation, like the need for a deputy commissioner that is fully in charge of the foods program? Is that sort of a barometer for you on how serious the review is in terms of calling for real change? Or is there a scenario in which the review doesn't include that, but is also really, I guess, has weight or teeth? Or is that sort of the issue that tells you whether or not they're really pushing for a real shakeup or change?
Yeah, that will definitely be a significant barometer as to how serious the reform recommendations will be in this particular report. And it's guaranteed that it's not going to be included. There may be some reference to it in the report in terms of how folks were aligned in the thinking of creating this empowered deputy commissioner position, but it certainly wouldn't end up as one of the recommendations from the report. That's certainly our anticipation. And part of the reason is that's not, the kind of the charge that they received from the FDA, excluded the Center for Veterinary Medicine, CVM, as part of it. So already they're taking that out of the equation. So that's a clear signal that they're not going to have this kind of comprehensive recommendation to create that structural change that's likely needed. And this structural change, it's a significant barometer. It's also, we shouldn't view it as a panacea. To Jen's step, this is one of many steps that are going to be needed in order to change the performance of the foods program, the kind of break down the kind of the siloed insular culture that exists there, that leads to situations that we saw play out with the infant formula situation, where certain people didn't get information at the same time about the problems that existed there, or blaming the mailroom for the reports that didn't make it across the agency. So it's things like that point to a greater problem. They're not, the Reagan-Udall report is not going to do that. I think, to Steve's point, it's going to kind of address some of the issues around the fringes that certainly that there can be some consensus on, but we're not going to be looking at wholesale changes. Part of it is FDA kind of undercut the process unfairly, and that's kind of how it's going to play out with the report. One other report that I think people should keep an eye on that'll come out next year is what the HHS-IG is working on, and that was called for by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut. She called for this at the beginning of the infant formula situation early last year. They typically take 18 months or so to do a report. I think I'm told that they're working on an expedited time frame. That will have probably some more objective perspective on the types of reforms that are needed. I would equate the Reagan-Udall report as kind of a college sports analogy, where you have the booster club looking at the athletic program to find out if there's any ethics violations. There'll be, we'll pretend to take it seriously, but really we're not going to be looking at anything meaningful here.
I'm curious, what do any of you think is the best case scenario then? I mean, I've heard that there isn't a lot of expectation that this review is going to really call, it's hard to sort of grade yourselves, even though it is outside of FDA, it's very closely linked. And obviously FDA, as you mentioned, set the parameters of the review. I mean, do any of you want to offer like a hopeful sort of like best case scenario for the review, or are you just sort of waiting to see this and then continue on with Congress and sort of with the message you think needs to be?
I'll offer that no matter what, the review is going to be very useful. It will be something to point to. It allows us, the group of us, to keep attention on this matter. So it's another milestone that we can hit. So regardless of what the report says, I think that the fact that there is a report is probably the most useful thing about it.
I think
that was very diplomatic. Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
There are a couple serious things that I think would show us that that the report has some extended usefulness in it. One, if they really tackle the culture issue, which I think they were trying to get to and recognize the challenge there. And I think the second thing is if they start to understand the multi-level system of a foods program is creating challenges of working in a uniform and consistent agenda. If they recognize those two things, those are huge moves forward, and those are things that others have never been able to understand or not been willing to recognize. So I think if they would say those two things, that's an improvement. And I would feel like, well, this was worth our time, the time and effort.
It was only 60 days of effort, 60 business days of effort. So not a lot of time lost in the process, but I'm just being cheeky.
No.
I want to pivot. By the way, if anyone has questions, you can drop them in the chat, which I think I can see here. Yeah. So if anyone has questions, you can drop them in the chat. We also have some questions from some folks in the audience when they registered. One of them, which I think is kind of a good one, is who are the real experts on food safety on Capitol Hill? Is there a lack of expertise, and are any new members stepping into this role? Obviously, we know Rosa DeLauro, current House Appropriations Chair. I call her the food safety hawk, like a defense hawk. She's a food safety hawk because she's been on this forever, on food safety issues. Everyone doesn't always agree with where she's coming from, but she's always interested and on it. There aren't a lot of members though. So I don't know. Do any of you have any thoughts about new voices that are coming into this space, or sort of maybe unexpected members who might be interested? Maybe we'll start with you, Adam. Do you have any?
So I mentioned
names. Yeah.
I know I'm reluctant to name names. I mean, obviously Rosa's been sort of a longtime leader on this issue. Congresswoman DeGette, as well as Eshu, have weighed in as well. We've had really great meetings with their staff, and I would expect and hope to see more engagement from them. I think one of the challenges that we face is the members and the staff themselves are pushed and pulled in 10 different directions every day. And no one, I think, has the time or the budget to dedicate 100% or even 20% of their time to focusing on this issue, right? And so there's a lot of smart and talented people up there, but they're being asked to do a million things at once.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Also, like, have we ever recovered from you not having like John Dingell and Waxman and like sort of because it does take a kind of a personal interest, I think, sometimes on this stuff, because it's like super weedy. Yes. As everyone on this panel knows, they're in this space, as I know many reporters and folks on this call or on this webinar also know, like, it can be complicated. So I think asking a staff member or like member of Congress to just like hop in can be maybe fraught sometimes. But I don't know, Brian, what you were on the Hill for a long while. Who do you think is going to step up on this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see, some of the more traditional food safety hawks, as you put it, start working on this too. People like Senator Durbin, Gillibrand, on the House side, Schakowsky, Adam mentioned Eshu, sticking with energy and commerce, you have Congresswoman Berrigan in California. She was very engaged with the infant formula hearings and asked a rather pointed question about who is in charge of food safety at FDA, which, as we all saw, they struggled mightily with responding to that question. And her and her staff have been very active subsequent to that. So I think you'll certainly see some emerging folks on the Hill focused on this, especially coming out of this infant formula situation, and you'll see new faces come up, like people like Congresswoman Berrigan.
Yeah, I think it's possible we could see another round of media coverage too on the infant formula stuff if this continues. Just the disruptions have just continued for so long that I do wonder if that doesn't, you mentioned lawmakers kind of finding their way into these issues that way, and it'll be interesting to see if that crops up again. I keep thinking I'm done covering the infant formula, like, okay, it's been 8 months, it's been 9 months, and then it just is not resolved. So that just continues to be a storyline. I want to turn to heavy metals and infant or baby food just for a minute, because that is one of the issues where Congress was very involved. There was the congressional report on flagging some concerns about manufacturers' own, I guess, lack of oversight, or maybe what their testing had been finding. And Brian, maybe just quickly, can you sort of give us an update on where that is? Because Congress was really interested, and then there was a ton of public outcry. FDA set some deadlines. We've already missed some of those. Where do you see that? And is anyone going to circle back to that, or where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's a shock, right, that FDA missed a deadline.
I'm not shocked anymore, but
no, that's right. I know coming out of the baby formula reports that had come out, both from Consumer Reports and also from Capitol Hill, Congresswoman Krishna Murthy's office and subcommittee staff putting that report together. And FDA kind of in response released a closer to zero plan to kind of limit long-term the heavy metal exposure in all foods, especially baby foods. But it just points to another issue that tends to kind of just fall off over the years, or it doesn't receive high priority. I know there's some instances within the agency where I think Steve may know more about this, just in terms of they don't view closer to zero as a priority to the commissioner, therefore they just tend to push it aside, and it doesn't get as much attention as it should. So it's things like that's a perfect example of an issue that just tends to languish when there's no strong leadership at the top. And we're going to be doing some follow-up testing Consumer Reports on baby food, and we're hoping that kind of can help facilitate even more discussion on it. Just kind of follow-up testing on other things too, just to hold companies accountable and kind of continue the debate on these heavy metal issues. So hopefully, Congress can re-engage on that in the new Congress, especially using these new test results, and we can get to a point where we start taking it seriously, and hopefully that the structural change can lead to kind of more serious consideration of this type of issue. So that's certainly a perfect example.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Certainly the initial drafts that FDA had worked on to set limits had some issues with OMB. Your point about leadership and sort of it being a priority, I think really shows it's hard to get a lot of this stuff out and done. And so it does require sort of a sustained focus on it. FDA does a huge job to their right. I feel like people are always like, oh, you're both very hard on FDA and also so sympathetic. And I'm like, yes, because have you ever looked at their job? It's 80% of the food supply. It's cosmetics. Microwaves, right. Medical devices. It's this huge job. So it's not they don't have anything to do. They have a huge job.
Yeah. A guidance on apple juice shouldn't languish for, more than 10, 12 years. But that's where we're at.
Right. Those two things can both be true. They're like,
Yeah,
they
right.
have a lot on their plate, and also like it's not okay for very kind of straightforward, seemingly straightforward policies to take a decade. We just saw FDA release a proposed update to the definition of healthy, which is more on the nutrition side, but it took 7 years. And I think that affects like 5% of products on the market. And you're just like, wow, that's a lot of bandwidth for something that seems sort of like low-hanging fruit. Maybe not everyone would agree with that characterization, but anyway, Jennifer, I was hoping you could maybe just talk briefly about if there's any like specific food safety issues. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you're looking to the Hill to look at, but just like from the produce perspective in this next year, are there like specific things? I know we just saw the traceability rule get finalized after
Finally, yes.
long road. Like, what else are you looking for in the next, I don't know, like 12 months that maybe is not on everyone's radar here? I think we have a lot of folks on the event here that probably are not living and breathing produce food safety like you are.
Yeah, well, and I, as a background, I'm trained as a scientist, so I'm not a lobbyist, policy person. Most of my interactions over my career have been with FDA itself, not with the Hill, because it's usually FDA who's doing the work, who's developing the regulations, who's developing the policies. It's pretty rare that I've had to go to the Hill. And so, I'm not looking to Congress to do a whole lot other than what we've talked about here. A lot of the things that I'm looking for in the space of produce safety really lie with the agency itself. You mentioned heavy metals in discussion with Brian, and this is an area where it's an example of where I think the FDA could leverage outside resources, leverage industry a little bit better to get their job done, because they do have an awful lot to do. And so why do it in isolation? Why do it in a silo in ways that take really long amounts of time if you can work in partnership with the industry? And I know that may not be comfortable for some. Is that a conflict of interest? But I think there are ways that the industry can help support the work that FDA is doing so that sound policies are developed and so that we have good solutions for some of these more complicated issues like heavy metals. You mentioned the traceability rule. Oh my gosh, it did take a very long time, and I am still
and some litigation, like some litigation.
Yeah. And they got a lot of public comment, which I think is great, that people care enough to comment. I'm still reading through all the rationale of how FDA developed the final rule. I know that a lot of people are going to find it very difficult to implement. And some may go to the Hill and complain. I don't think that there's anything in that final rule that surprised me, because it's what we have been talking about for a good 15 years at this point. And so I think developing guidance, and I'm happy for the industry to take some ownership of developing guidance with input from FDA. We can do it much more quickly than the agency can. So again, looking for opportunities to work together and to partner to move things forward, to move some of these issues forward, and to move the industry forward. One area where we are still lacking and where we as the industry can't take a leadership role is in establishing the definition of farm. So for produce, that's critical. For the traceability rule, it's critical. And there are many rules and interdependencies where these definitions are used and they have meaning. And when you don't have a clear recognition of the bounds of a farm, what is a farm and what is not a farm, it makes it difficult to move forward effectively. And I don't think that enforcement discretion is a great long-term solution. Let's establish a definition and figure it out and move forward. So farm definition is probably one of those outstanding issues. Since the produce safety rule was first proposed, it's been an outstanding issue. And we just want clarity. That's probably the main policy piece that we're looking for. We'll continue to work on outbreaks, on outbreak investigations, on transparency of information so that we can get to that root cause, so that we can understand what happened, put the measures in place to prevent things from happening again. This is a place where I think everybody is well-intentioned, but we need to be working better together to really solve these issues. Having confrontation, having an antagonistic relationship between regulators and industry just hasn't proven to be effective, hasn't proven to work well for anyone. So looking at outbreak investigations in a more collaborative fashion is another area where we'll be looking, have looked over the past couple of years, and we'll continue to put effort toward that in the next year, 2 years.
Do you think that the collaboration has gotten worse for outbreak investigations? And I ask that because, as maybe some folks in the audience are not as aware, or maybe you don't get all the emails, but FDA's outbreak list or outbreak investigation list at any given time has like a very large percentage of outbreaks unsolved, or they get closed without being solved. Some really large ones we have not solved this year. I mean, the Daily Harvest frozen food situation being probably the biggest example of that. But like, what do you see as the challenge there? I mean, is it that they're not working well with outside like companies that are involved in this, or like what do you mean by it not working together?
So I guess in a nutshell, FDA, my opinion is that FDA often puts on their regulator hat, and that's a much bigger hat than their public health hat. So as they're looking to build a case against a company, sometimes they're not looking to share information, background, context, sometimes not asking the right questions. And then, from the industry side, it's like, well, if they're not going to share with me, why would I share more with them? And so it just kind of devolves into a less productive exercise. I think if the approach was more from the public health, there's an issue, and yeah, maybe you're to blame, maybe you're not to blame, but let's try to figure this out. If the real motivation was let's figure it out, I think we could figure more of these things out together. Some of them we may not be able to figure out. And historically, over time, I think the collective, we have done a better job in figuring these things out. Historically, most outbreaks have gone unsolved. So I think that we're making progress. It's a really difficult thing to do. And the fact that FDA over the past couple of years has put this outbreak investigation table online, I think shines a light on the number of outbreaks that they're investigating, that CDC, public health agencies are investigating. We probably just didn't know the extent to which these things were happening before, the extent to which these things were unsolved, but they were. Now I think we have an opportunity that we see these things, we should be able to take some better action.
Yeah, they're also finding smaller outbreaks, right? They're detecting smaller outbreaks, which I think are harder to solve because you don't have, although, some of these other ones that haven't been solved were quite big. So, Steve, I was hoping you could jump in. Like, is there what are the issues in the next 12 months that from this more state and sort of food and drug, official lens, like what are you looking for that might be happening, not necessarily in Congress, but like any issues? I mean, are there so many swirling in the space, whether it's inspections or funding or what's FDA's paying the states to do inspections, or CBD, there's just like so many random issues swirling around. Like what are your top issues that maybe haven't gotten as much attention that you're looking for?
There's a handful, and some of them are really sitting at Congress. This year in the president's budget, through the FDA budget, they recommended a solution to information sharing. Right now, there's been a reinterpretation of statute, which has resulted in the inability to share information broadly between the FDA and state and local health officials. One more of those samples of we're not really working on a public health culture that we would expect from the agency and hope from the agency.
So you mean like even in like an outbreak investigation?
You can share upward, sharing downward is much harder.
And by upward, you mean to FDA to be okay.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and that's challenging. And not just in that, but we would want that same level of efficiency on inspection reports and violations, because many times the state has more ability to quickly and directly work with the firm to resolve issues and help reinforce the need to resolve issues than what FDA is. You know, an FDA warning letter is 4 months in a good time, and an injunction is, I don't even want to know how many months on average before we get to that point, or something more serious. So, you know, those sort of tools are something that information sharing is really important. The second thing is the current inspection model is costed out based on something that was built in 1976. So probably half of the people or more on this call were not born when we created the model that we're now using to fund much of the inspection system. It's probably no longer working. And it's no longer has predictability that we need. So there's a couple things that I think we can do is look at a different model. Also some predictability through funding. Perhaps, you know, in general world, most of the FDA food budget comes in a giant lump sum and then gets allocated amongst the agency. Well, maybe it's time for some line items that really say, this goes to this, this goes to this, this goes to this. That will help eliminate some of the challenges there. And I would say those are two things that I would be hoping we see some resolution on. The other thing I really do hope is, you know, the work that was done on the new era of smarter food safety, it is the right direction for the future. But getting buy-in even internally from the agency to move in that direction, you know, food delivery, we've got to address that, or we're going to end up with a hodgepodge of food deliveries across the country. You know, you mentioned cannabis, that wasn't there, but it should have been on that list in that report too. You know, when I think about it, retail food safety is another area that there's just a huge need for. We're going to see probably the most dramatic change in our life, or nearly our lifetime, in the food code, and the predecessors to the food code happen in this edition that's about to be released, and that's going to likely require menu labeling of allergens. That's pretty fundamental change and shift when you think about retail food safety, and particularly for those individuals impacted by allergens. So there's some big things coming. Traceability actually applies to the retail sector. I mean, when I say that, retail, restaurants, and grocery stores, that's new. That
yeah, retailers are not super thrilled with that, but yeah, I mean, your comments are just such a reminder of how complex a lot of this is, right? Like all of these new online businesses, delivery, food delivery, direct to consumer, that's like a whole new layer of complexity that we've kind of added in over the years that we haven't addressed with the way our federal regulations are set up. So, I mean, we could do a whole other panel on sort of the new wave of like different food business models and how we're not addressing those and how people are starting to think about that. And maybe Adam, that should be what we do our next panel on. But anyway, somehow we're out of time. I could talk to you guys for, you know, probably another 2 hours about this stuff, but just to keep everyone on their schedule for the day, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I encourage you to get in touch with all of these panelists. They know their stuff. Again, my name's Helena Bottemiller Evich. I write a newsletter called Food Fix, which you can find at foodfix.co if you're interested in this stuff. Thank you so much for your time today and for sticking with us a few minutes after. You all have been great. And thank you again to Invariant for organizing and hosting this. We really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your kind of gloomy afternoon if you're in Washington. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Helena.